Yagisian, the ruler of Antioch, showed unparalleled wisdom and courage, strength and judgment. If all the Franks who died attacking his city had survived, they would have overrun all the lands of Islam.
Ibn al-Athir would recount how Yagishihan, a man fabled for his big hairy ears and thick gray beard, did his utmost to keep the enemy out. But he knew any of the local Christians might be persuaded to let the Franks in.
When he heard the approach of the Franks, he was not sure how the Christian people of the city would react. So he sent all the Muslims outside the city walls to dig trenches. And the next day, he sent the Christians by themselves to do the same task. When they were ready to return home at the end of the day, he refused to allow them in. Antioch is yours, he said. But you have to leave it to me until I found out what happens between us and the Franks.
Yagishihan believed he had made Antioch unassailable. He then turned his attention to the Crusader army amassing outside his city walls.
Yagishihan is praised by all the sources about his good organization of the defense, night and day, night shifts, night guards, throwing oil at the Crusaders, depriving them from food supplies, sending guards during the night to attack their camps, burn some of their tents, depriving them of water supplies. He really confronted the Crusaders alone, and he fought vigorously to defend his city.
His efforts paid off. After 8 arduous months, the Crusaders were no closer to getting in, and conditions in the camp were utterly desperate. Food had always been scarce, and they had the expelled Christians to feed as well. As the siege dragged on, the Crusaders had virtually nothing left to eat. The Christian chronicler William of Tyre told how the Crusaders were forced to drain blood from their own horses and drink it.
Day by day, the shortage of provisions continued and the famine grew. And as a result, a pestilence broke out among the legions in the camp, so fatal that there was now scarcely room to bury the dead. With the loss of those who had wasted away through hunger and disease, and of others who had perished by the sword, the army had diminished to such an extent, it seemed as if barely half our numbers had survived.
The suffering of the Crusaders was about to get worse. In a medieval Islamic text, Dr. Taif al-Azhari has discovered how the leader of Antioch, Yagishihan, was able to summon reinforcements right under the nose of the Crusaders.
The answer was this: a pigeon. The Seljuk Turks were the first one to invent the postal service, kind of DHL of today. They would attach a message to the bird's leg and set it free. In a matter of hours, the message would come across and the help will arrive from anywhere in the Muslim world.
Two months later, Christian scouts reported that a massive Turkish army was on its way. The Crusaders had no time. They needed to break into the city quickly. It was Bohemund who found the weak spot in the city's defenses, a traitor in the Muslim ranks.
He was an armorer, a maker of breastplates, named Firuz. He worked at the tower that stood over the riverbed where the water flowed from the city into the valley. He had long served the ruler of Antioch, Yagishihan. But he sealed a pact with the Franks. They bribed him with a fortune in money and lands.
Firuz was the commander not only of one tower, but of 3 towers. Bohemund really hit gold dust. For whatever reason, he was ready to betray the city. And as so often happens, it was betrayal that let the enemy in, not a storming of the city.
Everyone really was really massacred, was killed. The Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and then spare really children or women or elderly, and they were really avenging and proving that they are really superior and they are the true and new master to the territory.
The one inhabitant of Antioch the Crusaders didn't manage to find was its Turkish ruler, Yagishihan. he managed to escape.
Yagisian was told they had taken the citadel. Panic seized him, and he opened the gates and fled with an escort of 30 pages. When he recovered his self-control, he repented having rushed to safety instead of staying there and fighting to the death. He started groaning and weeping. When he was at his last gasp, a shepherd passed by, killed him, cut off his head, and took it to the Franks at Antioch.
Yagishian's head on a stick was small consolation. Bohemund had much more to worry about. Yagishian's message had gotten through. The day after his execution, the Turkish reinforcements finally arrived. The Christian besiegers would now become the besieged. After an 8-month siege, the Crusaders had finally taken the ancient city of Antioch. Ironically, they had traded places with their enemy. The Christians were now the ones imprisoned behind its walls. The Turks, on the outside, ready to besiege. The Crusaders prayed for a miracle. And they got one. News spread that God had sent word to a Crusader in a vision. The Crusader was only a lowly priest from France, but his vision would inspire an entire army.
He was a pilgrim by the name of Peter Bartholomew. One night, so he said, St. Andrew the Apostle appeared to him and said, "Know, my son, that if you go to the church of the Blessed Peter in the city of Antioch, there you shall find the Holy Lance, the spear with which our Saviour Jesus Christ was pierced when he was hanging on the cross." And he swore that the whole story was true.
The real spear that pierced Christ's side has not been seen in centuries. To find the Holy Lance now, at a time of deep crisis, would be to establish a powerful connection between the Crusaders and Christ.
It's very significant that he seizes upon the idea of a simple relic, nothing complex, a simple relic, a signal from God that everybody can focus on, that is unarguable, undisputable. It isn't a story, it isn't just a vision, it's a solid metal token of God's will.
Peter Bartholomew handpicked his own band of 12 disciples and dashed to the small church to dig up the floor, where he claimed the Holy Lance was buried. After a day and night of frantic digging, hope had begun to fail. But Peter himself leaped into the pit inside the church and pulled out a piece of rusty metal. He claimed he had found the elusive Holy Lance, a claim Arab historians have ridiculed.
The holy man who proclaimed that the Messiah had a lance buried in the church was an extremely wily monk. He told them all, if you find it, you'll be victorious. Otherwise, you'll face a certain death. But before saying this, he went and buried the lance in the soil under the church. And then he covered his tracks.
The holy relics is a very interesting thing because as the crusading armies went, the number of holy relics multiplied. And people who wanted to make the equivalent of a quick buck went and found more and more holy relics. As to what these objects really were is, one can imagine anything. But the fact that they needed them shows that these holy relics became a primitive form of propaganda.
The people in the army recovered their morale, their fighting will. This is a moment of violent religious exaltation. The mood in the army changes, aggression replaces defeatism. This is an army ready to fight.
6 lines of battle were drawn up by those of us inside the city. We closed our ranks and, protected by the sign of the cross, we went out by the gate. When the Turks saw our squadrons so well drawn up, coming out one after the other, they said, "Let them come, so that we may have them the more surely in our power." But once we were all outside, and the Turks saw how great was the force of the Franks, oh, they were much afraid.
The Crusaders had just 200 horses left, but they still rode out to face the Turks head-on, the Holy Lance held high.
The Turks fled in terror, and with God's help we defeated them.
Whether the visions were real or just an elaborate hoax to boost morale, the city of Antioch was once again in Christian hands. But it would never be returned to the control of the Eastern Church of the Byzantine Emperor. Bohemond reneged on the promise he had made to Alexius a year before, and crowned himself Prince of Antioch.
When Bohemond decided to hold on to Antioch, he had completely broken his promise to Alexius. The idea that he would return lands that he conquered to the Byzantine Emperor was in tatters. He had also fractured and destroyed one of the basic ideas, one of the pillars, the catalyst of the First Crusade. The idea of Pope Urban that the Western Church would work with the Byzantines to defeat the Muslims of the Near East was no longer sustainable.
Great swathes of territory were now in Crusader hands. Baldwin controlled all the land around Edessa, and Bohemond the territory around Antioch. Both were now very rich men. By the end of 1098, as the leaders became increasingly consumed by running their new principalities, they began to stall on whether to continue the march on to Jerusalem.
There are huge arguments right across the range of the leaders, all the way through different levels of the army, about where the Crusades should go next. Should they immediately try to march on Jerusalem? Should they recover their strength? How long should they wait? What route should they take? And the potential is for the army to literally just fall apart, to go into different directions, for people to start returning home, to lose their impetus entirely. And it comes very close to this.
As the Crusade leaders squabbled, the troops demanded that the army march southward to Jerusalem. To them, the true goal of the Crusade had been forgotten. Their anger and frustration finally boiled over in a small town 2 days' ride from Antioch, called Marat al-Numan.
So this is where the legacy of the First Crusade really took place. I think it's a landmark for any historian to visit this place. This is where the First Crusader really made their violent legacy.
It would be here the Christians would commit the most evil atrocity of the Crusade. This is Dr. Taif Al-Azari's first visit to Marat al-Numan, the site of the most shocking atrocity of the First Crusade. As the Crusaders consolidated their hold on the land around Antioch, a small contingent arrived here in November 1098 under the leadership of Bohemond.
We came to the city named Marat, not far off, in which many Turks and Saracens lived. Bohemond sent an interpreter to the Saracen leaders to tell them if they, with their wives and children and goods, would take refuge in a palace just above the city gates, he would spare them from death. All our men entered the gates, and each of them seized his own share of whatever goods he could find in all the houses and cellars. And towards dawn, everybody was killed.
For all the inhabitants, some of them were really lit in fire, and people were really just fried inside, burned alive inside. Some managed to escape. Of course, they cannot really escape the butchery of the Crusaders, decapitated or knifed 1,000 times. 20,000, 25,000 were really massacred inside the town. Not only the Muslims were massacred, also Christians as well. Not only soldiers, but also children, elderly, women met their violent fate. So it was really a war crime place, kind of an ethnic cleansing.
Treachery followed by massacre had become the calling cards of the Crusader army. But as Christian witnesses revealed, it was what happened after the killing finally stopped that sets the story of Marat al-Numan apart.
The Franks stayed in the city for 1 month and 4 days. And while we were there, some of our men could not satisfy their needs. Either because Because we were there too long, or because they were so hungry, for there was no plunder to be had outside the city walls. So they ripped up the bodies of the dead, and others cut the dead flesh into slices and cooked it to eat. Our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits to devour their flesh.
There is no such thing as a spiritual war. When you fight a war, the aim of that war is to defeat your enemy. They involve violence, they involve threats, they involve propaganda, and they involve, let's put it like this, shock and awe. And the eating of human flesh was designed to strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Here we are strong, we are tough, and if necessary, we'll eat you up alive. And to a certain extent, that succeeded. I mean, there was a wave of horror and fear. They eat us. And if they're eating us dead tomorrow, they might eat us alive.
To the leaders of the crusade, the barbarity that took place at Marat proved that their troops wouldn't tolerate any more delays. The time had come to fulfill their vows and seize the city that had inspired them to risk everything in the name of God. It made no difference that Jerusalem had recently fallen into the control of a far more conciliatory Muslim power, the Fatimids of Egypt, and that they were calling for peace. In June 1099, 13,000 crusaders, less than a quarter of the number that had originally set out from Europe, arrived at the gates of the city where Jesus Christ had died.
When the Crusaders reached the walls of Jerusalem, they finally arrived at their goal. After 3 years, 3,000 miles marching, the most incredible suffering, terrible losses, they'd arrived at the holy city. Some were so overwhelmed with emotion they wept, others prostrated themselves on the ground. But now, of course, the hardest task of all faced them. They had to break in.
The Crusader army prepared to attack Jerusalem. The walls were 50 feet high and 10 feet thick. To scale them, they would need ladders and siege towers. But the Muslim defenders had razed the entire surrounding area of trees. The Christians sent out foraging parties to scavenge for wood. Hidden in a hole in the ground, they found 400 pieces of ready-prepared timber. It seemed, once again, God was giving them a helping hand. It was enough timber to build 2 50-foot siege towers with which to attack the walls of Jerusalem. Everything was in place for the final showdown. On the 14th of July, 1099, the Crusaders launched a two-pronged assault. 2 siege towers were rolled into place, one to the northwest and the other to the south of the city. The Muslim defenders knew if just one tower breached the walls, Jerusalem would fall.
You can look up at these walls and imagine missiles, stones, arrows raining down upon you. The fighting was barbaric and intense, and at one point the Crusaders gave the phrase live ammunition its literal meaning. They captured a Muslim, strapped him to a catapult and fired him back over the walls.
To the south, the Muslims pelted the first siege tower with pots of oil and flaming bolts, until finally it went up in flames. Now, only one siege tower was left, to the northwest of the city, under the command of the revered Crusader general, Duke Godfrey.
Godfrey decided upon a change of plan. I've got here an eyewitness account written by a man called Raymond of Aguirre. This is what he said. Godfrey moved to a position between the Church of the Blessed Stephen and the Valley of Josaphat.
Godfrey's plan was inspired. He had found the weak spot in the Muslim fortifications, but it was over a mile round to the northeast of the city. In the course of just a few hours, and under the cover of darkness, he had his men wheel the whole siege tower to the less defended part of the wall.
Here we are, the spot that the Crusaders broke into Jerusalem.
The Muslims mounted one last-ditch attempt to destroy Godfrey's siege tower.
They used grappling irons to try and snare the tower, to use the hooks to catch the wood, and then remarkably to pull the thing over. To counter this, the Crusaders had an enormous scythe made that would cut through these ropes. At one moment there was a brief fire there up on the walls. Godfrey saw this and lowered a makeshift bridge from his tower onto the battlements.
The walls were breached, and the Muslim defenders ran for their lives. The Christians, at last, could seize the holy city of Jerusalem.
We chased the Saracens, and killing them all the way up to Solomon's temple. Before long, its walls were streaming with blood. We killed both men and women, cutting off their heads with our drawn swords. The surviving Saracens dragged the dead bodies out in front of the city gates and piled them up in mounds as high as houses. No one has ever seen or heard such slaughter of pagans. For they burnt them on pyres as high as pyramids. No one knew how many there were. Except God. Jerusalem is ours.
The fact that against all the odds, seemingly in a miracle, this crusade took Jerusalem and achieved what it had set out to do, that seemed a very clear indication that God's hand was at work, and that its participants and all of Western Europe suddenly thought, this is true, God really does want a crusade to happen, God really is behind this venture.
Almost 3 years after he left his homeland in northern Europe, Duke Godfrey would become the new Christian ruler of Jerusalem. Humbly, he refused to be crowned king in the city where Jesus Christ had reigned. A year later, he died in the holy city. Baldwin, the treacherous lord of Edessa, rushed to fill his shoes. He didn't share his brother's theological qualms. He readily took the title King of Jerusalem. News sped back to Europe of the extraordinary success of the First Crusade. But the inspiration for 60,000 men to travel 3,000 miles, Pope Urban, died before learning that Jerusalem was back in Christian hands for the first time in 400 years. Jerusalem is less than half a mile wide. Within her walls, the Crusaders had massacred an estimated 30,000 Muslims and Jews. News of the slaughter rocked the Islamic world.
The Crusades had a very deep impact on Arab society. One, they were seen as a barbarian incursion, and stories of those crusades are still told in cafes and in families as if they happened yesterday. This is something quite striking. And so whenever the West has invaded that region again, people say it's another crusade, which is why after the awful events of 9/11, when the American president inadvertently, one assumes, said we now have to wage a crusade to stop this, a shiver went down the collective spine of the Islamic world, because they felt they knew what was coming.
As the Crusaders reveled in victory and plotted how to consolidate their hold on the Holy Land, slowly, steadily, the Muslims prepared to strike back. It would not be long before the wrath of Islam was unleashed on the fledgling Christian kingdom of Jerusalem. This Christian army had struggled its way 3,000 miles across the forbidding landscape of the Middle East in a series of epic encounters with the forces of Islam. After 3 years, this, the First Crusade, reached the walls of Jerusalem. Once inside, no one was spared. An estimated 30,000 citizens were slaughtered by the Crusaders. Muslims, Jews, even fellow Christians. But as the Crusaders reveled in victory, slowly, steadily, the Muslims prepared to strike back. Eventually, the wrath of Islam would be unleashed on the fledgling Crusader kingdom, under one leader, Saladin, and one battle cry, Jihad.
When Jerusalem was taken, during the First Crusade, the killings were horrible. Jews who'd gathered in the temple were burnt. Promises made to Muslims that Muslim women and children would be allowed out free were violated with impunity.
To Muslim eyes, two of their holiest shrines were now defiled. The Crusaders stabled their horses in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and at the Dome of the Rock, where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven. They tore off the Islamic symbols to reconsecrate the mosque as a church. In the heart of Jerusalem, its gleaming new crucifix boasted to the Muslims that this was now a Christian city.
They were just stunned and shocked by the violence, the brutality, the killings that were inflicted on them, and what shocked them even more, that this was done in the name of Christianity.
140 miles to the northeast, in the city of Damascus, thousands of Muslims flocked to the Umayyad Mosque to mourn the loss of Jerusalem.
Imagine the scene here when the news arrived from Jerusalem to the Damascene people that Jerusalem was captured. Not only captured, but the Muslims and Christians there, fellow Syrians, were massacred in their thousands. Every little corner was filled by men, by soldiers, taking their turbans off, moaning, weeping, and discussing what should happen.
Though the will of the people to rise up against the Christian invaders was strong, in 1099, the Muslim world was in no position to mount a counterattack. To the most celebrated Islamic chronicler of the age, Ibn al-Athir, the reason was clear. Its leaders were hopelessly divided.
Whilst the Christians were conquering and settling in our territories, the rulers and armies of Islam were fighting amongst themselves. This caused much discord and disunity among the people, and weakened their power to fight the Christian enemy.
The culture of Islam was magnificent, and big advances had been made in the sciences and mathematics. Nonetheless, the political institutions of Islam had not succeeded in creating a society which could be stable. And what we saw emerging was strong local rulers and what we can describe as city-states.
Since the death of Muhammad, the Islamic world had been split between two competing doctrines: the Sunni orthodoxy of Baghdad and Aleppo, and their bitter rivals, the Shia, who held power in Cairo. To defeat the Christians, they would need one leader who could unite the strength of the Muslims under the banner of war. This was the greatest fear of the Crusaders, a major Muslim counterattack. William of Tyre was a scholar and Christian archbishop whose chronicles have become the most important record of the life of the Crusaders. Through zealous Christian eyes, he recounted how the Muslims, or Saracens, began their guerrilla campaign against the fledgling Kingdom of Jerusalem.
The entire country surrounding this city was inhabited by infidel Saracens who were cruel enemies to our people. Even within these city walls, there was scarcely a place where one could rest in security. They reduced the realm to such a state of terror that no one dared venture outside the fortifications.
To survive in this hostile environment, the Christians who remained after the First Crusade had to secure their grip on their new kingdom.
After the capture of Jerusalem, many of the Crusaders returned home. There's only maybe 200 or 300 knights left there. Jerusalem must have seemed quite an empty place. I mean, physically, it's quite a big city. What the Crusaders had to do, of course, was to try and hold on to that, try to consolidate it, and also try and get more people out there. That was the crucial thing.
The Catholic Church appealed for European families to come and settle in Jerusalem. The homes of Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews were requisitioned to house the new arrivals.
Recruiting tours went around Western Europe, advertising the idea, much as when Americans were told to sort of go west. This was go east, young man. You're going to get good property, good tax deals. You've got a sort of sense of adventure. The other thing, of course, you'll be living in Christ's patrimony. There's that extra element to it as well.
Everybody who is faithful to Christ, he has an inclination to go to the place where Jesus lived, where Mary, his mother, lived, the apostles. And also, because Christianity derives from the Jewish roots, also where the prophets lived.
In the aftermath of the First Crusade, Jerusalem blossomed into a thriving spiritual metropolis with a population of around 30,000, about the same size as medieval Paris.
What we have after the First Crusade is a series of nails that are hammered into the fabric of the Holy Land. Strong points that the Crusaders have, but they have to be connected. They have to link up these cities that they've taken and consolidate the territory.
Europeans set up new farms, villages, and castles around the captured cities, and created 4 powerful new Crusader states: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now that the Holy City was Christian, pilgrim visitors from Europe poured into Jerusalem.
Every year, thousands of them flocked here, determined to walk in Christ's footsteps and to worship at the holy places. Like tourists of today, they needed advice on food, drink, where to stay, healthcare, and they also needed a guidebook.
The top attraction in this 12th century guidebook was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Rebuilt by the Crusaders to house the key holy sites under one roof, it was a spiritual tourist complex for thousands of faithful visitors. The guide also included the essential destination for every traveler: the souvenir shop.
Hi, I'd like to buy some souvenirs, please.
Yes, please. What do you want?
Yeah, the holy water actually is what I was most interested in. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, you've got holy water, holy oil, holy incense, holy earth.
Where's the water come from?
The water comes from River Jordan.
Right.
It has been blessed inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Okay.
Do you want anything else? Rosaries, holy oil, holy earth?
No, I think
with the holy water?
No, that's fine. It's the holy water I was really after.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, sir.
In the back streets of Jerusalem, the pilgrims found not just souvenirs, but also a taste of foreign food.
Pilgrims needed to eat, and this is the notorious street of bad cooking. Fast food for the Middle Ages. Now, it's quite possible, of course, that you're going to get ill, and you're going to need some help. Let's look at the guidebook and see what they have to say about it. Next to the Holy Sepulchre is the hospital, in which a great crowd of sick people is collected. The total of persons at the time when I was present was 2,000. Between night and day, there were sometimes more than 50 corpses carried out. But again and again, there were new people admitted.
On capturing the city, the Crusaders had taken over the Hospital of St. John. Here, Christian pilgrims who fell ill were cared for by the men who took holy vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Known as hospitalers, they soon took on a military role to ensure the safe passage of thousands of pilgrims to and from the Holy Lands.
All along the way are bandit bands lying in wait for you, waiting to pounce on you. So much so that a pilgrim in the early 12th century, writing an account of pilgrimage, said that the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem was littered with the bones of dead pilgrims, and that if you were with pilgrims and one of your friends, one of your buddies was killed, don't stop to bury him, because the grave you dig, he said, will be your own.
To offer increased protection to these pilgrims, a second holy order had been established. Combining a monastic way of life with the bearing of arms, this brotherhood believed fighting off the infidel was both an act of charity and a way to salvation. They became known as the Knights Templar, taking their name from their headquarters, the ancient site of the Temple of Solomon. Both of these military orders would quickly become for the Muslims the most feared and reviled symbols of the Crusader occupation.
They both become immensely powerful as monastic orders and as political forces in the Crusader states. They're able to do this because both the Hospitallers and the Templars develop military strength. They become the elite fighting troops of the Crusader states, and they're essential to the survival of this world.
To underpin the defense of their new kingdom, the Templars and the Hospitallers oversaw the construction of a chain of castles. The most magnificent was Crat de Chevalier in modern-day Syria. Stark symbols of authority, these castles declared to the Muslims that the Christians were here to stay. But the Muslims dreamed of fighting back against the Crusaders and returning Jerusalem to their faith. An old Arabic word was being uttered once again. The word for struggle, jihad. Through the early 12th century, men across the Muslim world began to talk of rising up under the banner of jihad against the Crusader occupation.
The jihad is the key element in the armory of Muslim ideology. The notion of jihad dated from the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, so it's something that's integral to the Islamic faith. It's not something that's invented to sort of counter the crusade. It's there and it's sort of taken off the shelf and deployed against the Crusaders.
Imad al-Din Zengi, a Turk, was the ruler of the city of Mosul, now part of modern-day Iraq. Intelligent and ruthless, Zengi was intent on expanding his empire. He would be the first leader to launch a successful jihad against the despised Christian invaders.
for him, it was essential that he defeat and move them out of the Muslim heartland. To do this, he had to unite Syria under his leadership.
The mighty citadel of Aleppo is one of the oldest Islamic fortress cities in the world. The Knights of the First Crusade had never dared to attack it. Like most of the Muslim world at the time, it was an independent city-state with its own ruler. Zengi set his sights on this fortress as his new power base, a springboard to topple the Crusaders. With his military strength growing, he offered to protect Aleppo from the Christians. In 1128, an agreement was reached, and Zengi took control of the city. With Mosul and Aleppo, he now controlled northern Syria.
Before he came to power, we had no one to impose justice, and the presence of the Christians in our land had made the country into a wilderness. And he made it flower again.
It took Zengi nearly 20 years of brutally fighting his fellow Muslims before he finally united northern Syria.
His own secretary described him as a lion, some kind of fierce wild cat. I believe the words that he used to describe him were a raging calamity. Zengi was one of those, fortunately, minority of the human race who seemed to have enjoyed causing pain to his fellow human beings. His own troops followed him in terror, it was said, because if he told them not to step on crops on their route of march, and one of them did, he would have him hanged.
In 1144, Zengi was now at last ready to let loose his ruthlessness on the crusade. 120 miles from his power base in Aleppo was Edessa, one of the Crusader states. And Zengi had just learned of a golden opportunity to recapture the city.
Zengi had always coveted Edessa and looked for a chance to achieve his ambition and take it. Once he heard that the Prince of Edessa was out of the city, it was like a sign from God for him to advance.
Nearly half a century after the foundation of the Crusader states, the Muslims were finally about to strike their first counterblow. Zengi besieged the city with an army of 30,000 men. The few Crusader knights who remained to protect Edessa were taken by surprise and desperately retreated within the walls. For Muslims, this was the long-awaited show of strength, and the great Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir reveled in it.
They battered the walls ceaselessly, and nothing interrupted their remorseless struggle. His troops were as numerous as the stars in the sky, and the fields around the city were filled with them. They say that birds dare not fly near. So absolute was the destruction by the besiegers, and so unwinking their vigilance.
The fortifications were so strong that the only way to get inside Edessa was to bring its walls tumbling down. Zengi brought in expert miners who knew precisely how to attack the wall's foundations.
Going over walls is difficult because you get shot at and all the rest of it. But under the city walls there was a natural cave system, and his men broke into the cave system and started to pick away at the bottom of the walls.
The Christian settlers in the city desperately tried to defend the tunnels, but they stood little chance against Zengi's powerful assault. His troops set fire to the wooden beams supporting the tunnels. As they burned, the walls above came crashing down.
Tunneling is actually very effective, and very quickly Zengi's troops broke into the city.
Once inside, the Muslims began to slaughter the Christian inhabitants. Thousands of men and women and children were killed. William of Tyre chronicled the terror of his fellow Christians as they fled to the safety of their citadel, the tower in the heart of the city.
The more prudent of the citizens rushed to the citadel so that they might at least preserve their lives, if only for a short time. At the gate there was such a crush of people trying to enter that because of the press of the crowd many were suffocated and died miserably.
Edessa was now back in the hands of the Muslims, and Zengi, the hero of the Islamic world. The first phase of the jihad, the struggle against the Christian Empire, was won.
The taking of Edessa marked an important stage in the taking back of Jerusalem, because what it created was the feeling we can do it.
Although Zengi had led his people to victory, he wasn't admired. He remained brutal and feared.
He had told one of his slaves that the next morning the slave would be killed for having offended Zengi in some minor way. And the slave, assuming that his life was over anyway, decided to take Zengi with him that night.
As the mighty Zengi slumbered amidst his proud army, ringed by his braves with their swords, he perished. Neither riches nor power were of use to him.
2 years after the taking of Edessa, the 59-year-old Zengi was murdered in his bed. The hopes of the Islamic world might have died with him. But there was another willing to take up the challenge. His own son, Nur al-Din, a man who would prove to be a very different leader than his father. Nur al-Din was the son of the brutal Turkish warlord Zengi. He was ready to continue his father's battle, and he set out to unite the Muslim world and restore Jerusalem to Islam.
Nur al-Din was a very pious man. Did not like too much play, did not like the way in which the caliphs lived in Baghdad with their opulence and their splendor and their dancing girls and their wines, and said one reason why we have suffered these defeats is because we as a people have become too indulgent. He was highly respected because he never misused his authority and his power.
The Christians saw the rise of this new leader as a serious threat to the Crusader kingdoms. His message was simple and direct: unity and jihad.
Nur al-Din's vision was very straightforward. Our countries have been occupied by the barbarians, and we have to free them. And the only way to free them, they have waged holy war on us, we will wage a holy war against them.
In Europe, word reached the Pope of the fall of Edessa. On December 1st, 1145, Pope Eugenius III was compelled to take drastic action. He called for a second crusade.
The Second Crusade was an extraordinarily ambitious scheme. It was an idea of extending the borders of Christianity in every single direction. Christians were terribly confident at this time. They looked upon it as a sort of a rerun of the First Crusade. And a lot of the preaching stresses the idea that the Crusaders should live up to the deeds of their fathers.
The call to arms was answered by one of the most powerful men in Europe, King Louis VII of France, and his wealthy wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
The First Crusade had been led by nobles, counts. Here, the King of France, King Louis VII, took the cross. This was, of course, quite a sort of radical move. The idea of a king leaving his lands for 2 or 3 years, having probably a sort of 1 in 3 chance of dying, it's a dangerous thing.
King Louis had a deep Christian faith and was determined to honor the exploits of the First Crusaders by retaking Edessa and then expanding the Crusader kingdoms. But he was a man of very little military experience and not a natural leader. In May 1147, he set off on the Second Crusade, leading an army of more than 30,000. At the heart of his fighting force were 300 highly skilled Knights Templar. It took Louis's Crusader army nearly 5 months to cross Europe, from France to Asia Minor. The journey took them through the rugged landscape of central Turkey, along this still intact Roman road.
The logistical problems of the Second Crusade were pretty frightening, because they decided to move inland through the mountains of southeast Anatolia, through this kind of terrain, in winter. Now that's a very bad time of the year to be moving. Very little food in the countryside. We know that they were almost entirely dependent on what they could carry. Many of the roads they were on high mountains like these in the background, narrow terraces, animals are falling off, men desperate to keep the food.
But logistical problems weren't the only challenges the Crusaders faced. The route took them through Turkish land, where they were in constant fear of attack by the local Muslim forces.
You've got to think, although this is mountainous terrain, there's plenty of open land. Over here, the Turks would be hovering, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. The strength of the army lies in its compact, tight formation.
By now it was winter, and harsh weather conditions caused the Crusaders to lose their tight formation. the heavily armed vanguard became separated from the main body, and the slow wagon train led by Louis and Eleanor was left behind and exposed. It was just the opportunity the Turks needed. Christian historian William of Tyre interpreted what happened next as a punishment from God.
In battle array, they fell upon our forces, and fought at close quarters with the sword, and brought death and destruction to the Christians. In punishment for our sins, the infidel conquered. An army was reduced to a very few. That day, the glorious reputation of the Franks was lost.
Louis and Eleanor escaped, but thousands of Crusaders were killed. To restore discipline, the humiliated Louis surrendered control of the march to the Templars. The battered Crusader army staggered on to take refuge in Antioch, a city they had taken on the First Crusade. There, faced with a diminished force of 20,000 men and the growing strength of Nur al-Din, Louis abandoned the campaign to retake Edessa in the north and instead looked south to Damascus, a city much closer to Jerusalem. Nur al-Din also had designs on this independent Muslim city. The question was, who was going to take it first? In 1148, Louis made the first move.
The attack on Damascus can be seen as a preemptive strike against Nur ad-Din. He ruled Aleppo. If he was to take Damascus to the south, it would be the first time a Muslim had governed these two key cities. The whole eastern flank of the Crusader states would be governed by one single man with growing power, growing wealth, and a great, great threat.
While in the past, Damascus had been an ally of the Crusaders, it had recently become hostile.
The people of Damascus got really terrified because no one else before came that close to the city walls. The Damascenes, simply like any other inhabitants, trying to defend their homes, trying to defend their families, trying to defend their habitat, their livelihood.
The Damascenes could have called on the ruler of Aleppo, Nur al-Din, to rescue them, but that would mean surrendering their independence. They were determined to defend their city themselves.
They were really defending Islam against the Crusaders, against the Frankish army, and they were really looking to die, to go to heaven, according to their beliefs.
If there was one man who embodied their spirit of defiance, it was 71-year-old lawyer Al-Findalawi. His story has become part of the folklore of Damascus. His tale is still told today by storytellers in the city cafes.
The Crusaders believed in their evil hearts they could take Damascus. 50,000 infantry and cavalry marched on our city, and the Muslims challenged them to fight. In an orchard by the walls, the battle began. Al-Findalawi, the old lawyer, was determined to fight the infidel. So he went into battle, striking down Christians in the orchard like a man possessed. He said, "I have offered myself for sale, and God has bought me."
هجم عليهم ضربنا والرماه والخامس يعني امه بعجب.
But through the night, the townspeople became demoralized by the horror of the fighting. After a fierce struggle, the Crusaders overwhelmed the Muslims and closed in on the city walls, closer than any army in ancient or modern times.
رأى الفندلاوي بالمنام. Hello.
Al-Findalawi continued to fight bravely and refused to withdraw in obedience to God Almighty. But alas, he fell in battle, a martyr for the faith.
For days, the battle raged in the orchard surrounding the city, and thousands of Muslims lost their lives. The proudly independent Damascenes now had little choice. They sent word to Nur al-Din, pleading for him to send his army. It was just the news Nur al-Din had been waiting for, but it left Louis with a crucial decision: to stay and fight a growing Muslim opposition, or to retreat.
If they withdrew from Damascus, they felt they would be shamed. If they stayed and fought, they might be defeated. So what they actually did was the worst of all worlds. They shifted their siege from one side of the city to the other, and then decided they had to retreat anyway. This was military incompetence.
Louis returned home to Europe, shamed and defeated. After so much hope, expense, and suffering, his second crusade had ended in disaster. Not only had he turned his back on the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, he had strengthened the resolve of the Muslims. For Christians, the consequences were calamitous.
They abandoned the siege and returned home. As a result, fewer people undertook this pilgrimage thereafter. From this day on, the conditions for the Latins in the East declined.
Dominic, the future saint, leads a serious life. He has often been described as austere, a description motivated by his own words.
A man who governs his passions is master of his world. It is better to be a hammer than an anvil.
But stories of Dominic indicate that under this severe exterior beats a gentle heart. On one occasion, he sells his books, annotated in his own hand, to relieve the starving poor. Twice he tries to sell himself into slavery, to raise money to liberate people who are held captive by Spanish Muslims. Legend has it that while in Rome, Dominic receives a vision of a beggar who, like Dominic, would do great things for the faith. Dominic meets the beggar the next day. Embracing him, Dominic says, "You are my companion and must walk with me. If we hold together, no earthly power can withstand us." The beggar is Saint Francis of Assisi.
Francis is, in my view, the purest example of that wild idea of just dropping what you have and just go out in the wilderness, follow Christ, preach the gospel. Very simple, very straightforward, very crazy, very endearing.
Born the son of a wealthy merchant, he rejects a life of comfort and adopts poverty. At a time when it is believed that riches glorify God, this in itself is revolutionary. But while many may abandon the mainstream to seek simplicity, few have the charisma to draw followers into a great order.
Well, the story is told that Francis went to see Pope Innocent III. Now, you have to realize Innocent III was the most powerful pope that has ever lived. I mean, he had Europe in his hand. And here comes this man dressed in rags, asking that he wants to found a new order. And the story goes that the Pope told him, "You smell like a pig. Go and live among them."
St. Francis proceeds to do just that.
And St. Francis went and found himself a pigsty and sort of rolled in it for a while, and suddenly came back and asked for another audience with the Pope. He said, "Holy Father, I have done as you commanded. Now will you please do as I beg?" And Innocent was so moved that the order began.
Ironically, order is the last thing Francis wants. In the monastic culture of the day, monks adhere strictly to rigid rules and routines. Francis is notoriously disorganized and cannot bring himself to create a set of guidelines for his brotherhood. One thing he does do is set down the whisperings of his heart in prayer.
Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Let me not so much seek to be consoled as to console. Let me not so much seek to be understood as to understand. Let me not so much seek to be loved as to love. Francis of Assisi.
Unlike the cloistered monks who preceded them, the Franciscans and Dominicans bring the word of God directly to the people. Shrouded in the mantle of poverty and grace, they are among the most effective messengers of the Church. At this time, women also discover innovative new ways of expressing their Christianity. Among them are groups so informal they never even try to become a new order. Often they are just a few souls sharing a house in a village or town, who dedicate their lives to prayer, devotion, and charitable works such as caring for the sick and the poor.
Women could shed their femaleness by becoming nuns. and by becoming virgins, they became, in the words of one of the fathers of the church, honorary males. By becoming virgins, they became, in the words of one of the fathers of the church, honorary males.
Prophets and preachers, men and women, the ordered and the independent, all contribute to the surging vitality of Christianity. But there are those who harshly condemn the church, and these come to be called heretics. In a time when so much rides on salvation, and when, as Rome would have it, salvation can only come through the church, there is no greater threat than heresy. Pope Innocent III determines to root the heretics out. He dispatches his powerful new moral force, the Dominicans. When even their most determined but peaceful efforts fail, the Pope commissions armies to seek and destroy heresy wherever they find it. It is a campaign that pits French against French, Christian against Christian, and gives the heretics one choice: recant or die. A brutal war rages for 20 years, and even though tens of thousands are killed, the resolve of the heretics only hardens. The crusade fails. In the year 1231, the problem falls to Pope Gregory IX. He develops a brand new initiative, commissioning clergymen to go into the country and establish what amounts to courtrooms of Christianity. These formal investigations into an individual's faith will be called the Inquisition. Christianity's long night of horror is about to arrive. It is the middle of the 13th century. The Church of Rome has helped deliver Western Europe from the barbarians, and Christianity is experiencing unparalleled growth. With these achievements comes a dark side, for the Church has also launched the Inquisition. It is an era when church and state frequently overlap. The clergy believes it is their duty to protect the people from error. Barely 50 years after the Inquisition begins, Spanish King Peter of Aragon proclaims,
"The enemies of the cross of Christ and violators of the Christian law are likewise our enemies and the enemies of our kingdom, and ought therefore to be dealt with as such."
The Inquisition casts its shadow across much of Europe. With the silent acknowledgement of Europe's rulers, the terrible excesses of these so-called courts of faith grow unchecked. On the Spanish peninsula, where some of the worst of the Inquisition takes place, a campaign is conducted to drive Muslims out of the country. By the middle of the 15th century, nothing is left of the area's Islamic communities except Granada. In 1469, Granada's fate is sealed by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their powerful union combines Aragon and Castile to form what is now known as Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella's armies conquer Granada in the spring of 1492, just months before Christopher Columbus set sail for the New World. For the first time in over 700 years, there is no Islamic rule anywhere in Western Europe.
There were some periods where Spain was the most tolerant country anywhere in Western Europe, and probably anywhere in the Mediterranean, where Christians and Muslims and Jews lived together, people intermarried. There was no sense that somehow, if you are a Muslim or if you're a Christian, you have to be out.
But Ferdinand and Isabella want a unified Spain, not just in government, but a Spain unified in Christianity. To achieve this, they bend a tool of the church to their own ends. This is the Spanish Inquisition.
It's a way to unify Spain and make it a centralized state. Hitherto, Iberia had been split up into different kingdoms. Now it was to be one kingdom, and it had to have a common ideology. And that meant that you couldn't tolerate deviance in the same way as before.
In 1492, the Jews are required to convert or leave Spain. On the very same day that Columbus first heads east across the Atlantic, thousands of Jews also sail off, leaving forever the country that had been their homeland for generations. Those who remain and convert become the most likely candidates for the inquisitors. Within a decade, Muslims are also forced to make the same difficult choice of conversion or deportation. By the early 16th century, through state terror and at a cost of a great many lives, Ferdinand and Isabella unite Spain under a single church, the Catholic Church. The Inquisition might well have exhausted itself at this point, but a new threat to the Church of Rome is about to arise. A group of people who call themselves reformers will soon produce the most monumental revolution Christianity has ever seen. And just as this great theological revolution in Christianity is about to unfold, a revolution in technology occurs in Germany. These two events will become interwoven into history. It is the middle of the 15th century in a town called Mainz. Johann Gutenberg creates the modern printing press with his invention of movable, metal alphabetic characters. Among the first books to be printed is the Bible. The good book is about to become directly accessible to the people. Some 75 years later in Britain, a man named William Tyndale translates the New Testament into lively, simple, and thoroughly readable English. It is printed in 1526.
People can now read for themselves, and it's not a very big step from the idea that you can read for yourself to the idea that you have to interpret what you've read, and now you can think for yourself.
This is not seen as a welcome development in all quarters. Up until now, the Bible has only existed in Latin, the domain of educated clergy. Translating the Bible into native languages is viewed as heresy and a direct threat to the church. For this, Tyndale is strangled and burned at the stake. The translations of Tyndale and others bring to an end the autocracy of knowledge which the clergy holds over the people. Back in Germany, another man is also translating the Bible, this time into German. But this man will be known for far more than his translations. His name is Martin Luther. It is the eve of All Saints' Day, October 31st, 1517. The small town of Wittenberg. Luther, a common friar, approaches the door of the town's church. He is outraged by the excesses of the Catholic clergy. The Archbishop of Mainz has just sponsored a sale of church indulgences to help pay for the construction of St. Peter's in Rome. It is salvation at a price. Salvation for those who can afford to buy it.
An indulgence technically means the substitution of one penance for another. But by Luther's time, it had become corrupted because the church simply said you can make a financial contribution and that will suffice in place of certain penances.
Luther is about to deal the symbolic blow that will begin the Reformation. He nails his protest, a list of 95 theses, to the door of Wittenberg's church. This small act will give rise to a radical new sect of Christians who will derive their very name from this protest: Protestants. Luther will be reviled for tearing apart the one church and thereby threatening the very essence of Western civilization.
How do you hold together something as diverse as Europe? You held it together by a common Christianity. That's the reason why any break in that common Christianity is greeted so ferociously, because it's not merely a disruption of faith and not merely a disruption of society. It's a kind of undercutting of civilization.
The more Luther scrutinizes church practice, the more he finds fault. Beginning in 1517, Luther publishes a series of works that are increasingly sharp attacks upon the church. He finally comes to call the Pope an Antichrist.
This would be the same thing as someone coming to you today and saying, I think the presidency of the United States is an abomination. I think we should abolish the Supreme Court, get rid of Congress, and we should have a dictator or something like this. I mean, you're completely upsetting the established order of things. This is shocking. It's unthinkable.
In response to Luther's shocking criticisms, Pope Leo X issues an edict condemning dozens of Luther's works and giving him 60 days to recant. The response is characteristically Luther.
The papal bull is the sum of all impiety, blasphemy, ignorance, impudence, hypocrisy, lying. In a word, it is Satan and his Antichrist.
Not surprisingly, Luther is excommunicated. But by German law, he must have a trial. The church looks to Charles V to oversee Luther's hearing, which is to take place in the German city of Worms. Charles, a young king of Spanish origin, has just been elected Holy Roman Emperor. Luther's followers have become so numerous that they are seen not just as a threat to the church, but a threat to civil stability. At the hearing, the emperor asks Luther to recant. To this, Luther delivers his now famous response.
Unless I am convinced by Scripture, I neither can nor will recant anything, since it is neither right nor safe to act against conscience. God help me.
Luther is declared an outlaw.
So Luther leaves the Diet of Worms and excommunicated, an outlaw in violation of the law.
Attacked their camps, burned some of their tents, depriving them of water supplies. He really confronted the Crusaders alone, and he fought vigorously to defend his city.
His efforts paid off. After 8 arduous months, the Crusaders were no closer to getting in, and conditions in the camp were utterly desperate. Food had always been scarce, and they had the expelled Christians to feed as well. As the siege dragged on, the Crusaders had virtually nothing left to eat. The Christian chronicler William of Tyre told how the Crusaders were forced to drain blood from their own horses and drink it.
Day by day, the shortage of provisions continued and the famine grew. And as a result, a pestilence broke out among the legions in the camp, so fatal that there was now scarcely room to bury the dead. With the loss of those who had wasted away through hunger and disease, and of others who had perished by the sword, the army had diminished to such an extent, it seemed as if barely half our numbers had survived.
The suffering of the Crusaders was about to get worse. In a medieval Islamic text, Dr. Taif al-Azari has discovered how the leader of Antioch, Yagi Shihan, was able to summon reinforcements right under the nose of the Crusaders.
The answer was this: a pigeon. The Seljuk were the first one to invent the postal service, kind of DHL of today. They would attach a message to the bird's leg and set it free. In a matter of hours, the message would come across and the help would arrive from anywhere in the Muslim world.
Two months later, Christian scouts reported that a massive Turkish army was on its way. The Crusaders had no time. They needed to break into the city quickly. It was Bohemund who found the weak spot in the city's defenses, a traitor in the Muslim ranks.
He was an armorer, a maker of breastplates, named Firuz. He worked at the tower that stood over the riverbed where the water flowed from the city into the valley. He had long served the ruler of Antioch, Yagi Shihan. But he sealed a pact with the Franks. They bribed him with a fortune in money and lands.
Firuz was the commander not only of one tower, but of 3 towers. Bohemund really hit gold dust. For whatever reason, he was ready to betray the city. And as so often happens, it was betrayal that let the enemy in, not a storming of the city.
Everyone really was really massacred, was killed. The Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and didn't spare really children or women or elderly, and they were really avenging and proving that they are really superior and they are the true and new master to the territory.
The one inhabitant of Antioch the Crusaders didn't manage to find was its Turkish ruler, Yagi Shihan. He managed to escape.
Yagi Shihan was told they had taken the citadel. Panic seized him, and he opened the gates and fled with an escort of 30 pages. When he recovered his self-control, he repented having rushed to safety instead of staying there and fighting to the death. He started groaning and weeping. When he was at his last gasp, a shepherd passed by, killed him, cut off his head, and took it to the Franks at Antioch. Yagisian, the ruler of Antioch, showed unparalleled wisdom and courage, strength and judgment. If all the Franks who died attacking his city had survived, they would have overrun all the lands of Islam.
Ibn al-Athir would recount how Yagishihan, a man fabled for his big hairy ears and thick gray beard, did his utmost to keep the enemy out. But he knew any of the local Christians might be persuaded to let the Franks in.
When he heard the approach of the Franks, he was not sure how the Christian people of the city would react. So he sent all the Muslims outside the city walls to dig trenches. And the next day, he sent the Christians by themselves to do the same task. When they were ready to return home at the end of the day, he refused to allow them in. Antioch is yours, he said. But you have to leave it to me until I find out what happens between us and the Franks.
Yagishihan believed he had made Antioch unassailable. He then turned his attention to the Crusader army amassing outside his city walls.
Yagishihan is praised by all the sources about his good organization of the defense, night and day, night shifts, night guards, throwing oil at the Crusaders, depriving them from food supplies, sending guards during the night to